let's look at the first one, that polygamy protects women. Number one, it does not. In current societies now, Muslims believe in polygamy up to a certain number of people. However, look at the women there, and do you think they're protected? What it does is it allows them to become more of property. It allows them to be seen as just one of many instead of one special person. It cheapens the idea of women. And when you cheapen women, when you cheapen any human being, then it increases the risk of danger towards them.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today to talk about my interview with Rich Tidwell. And I don't like doing solos very often. Now, I've been told I should not give this guy a platform, that we shouldn't do that. But I disagree. I think truth requires us to give all sides a platform, no matter how crazy the sides are. But because truth, in my opinion, will come out. And I think truth is extremely important. I think it was us sticking our heads in the sand when it came to the LGBT movement that has been moving up slowly and slowly and slowly to the fact where we are now way past the point of crazy, when they are transitioning kids at very young ages. And for some reason, some people in the world think it's normal, but it's normal enough where we give it a platform. But part of the problem was because we kept quiet at the early stages of it. And although Rich and I would actually agree that that was wrong, and he and I agree on a lot of points when it comes to other forms of biblical truth, whether it comes to abortion or homosexuality, etc., we strongly disagree on this idea of polygamy. And I believe, and I think when there is any type of deception, I think it is our job as Christians to speak out about it. And I think we have an obligation to speak out regardless of whether it's comfortable or not. And I don't think it's a matter of giving him a platform. I think it's a matter of being able to expose the truth in the midst of what is going on. Paul did not give a platform to those people he was listing out to indicate that they have a problem. Paul was calling them out, saying they are deceivers. So whenever people are referencing groups or ideas, and they're not necessarily giving it a platform, I think Rich Tidwell has a very strong biblical knowledge, but I think he uses that biblical knowledge to justify a thought and an idea. And unfortunately, I did not ask how he came to that conclusion when it came to his own personal life. Like, how did it actually take place when he took that second wife? Honestly, I can't imagine me being able to live through my wife without her killing me if I told her, hey, by the way, the neighbor down the street, I think she's really gorgeous. So I think, you know what? I think we should practice polygamy. I don't think that would have been very, very wise, but I don't know he did it that way. I don't know. I'm just kind of being a little tongue-in-cheek about it right now. Nevertheless, I do want to go through the arguments that he has made and my thought processes behind it, some of which you can kind of tell from my questions, but I want to be a lot more clear with it. I think it is important that we address this and deal with this completely. If I mischaracterize anything that he said, please reach out to me and let me know. You could do it in the comments sections, etc. I try to be very careful to not do that. That's one of the reasons why I like being able to have conversations with people, because I think it's easier to allow them the opportunities to correct you when you say things incorrectly. However, I'm going to go through some of his arguments and talk about it, and they're in no particular order. These are just the arguments that I thought of as we went down this list, and some of them he may have said in something else in my research that I put down but I did want to make certain that I covered it. So I think most of these, if not all of these, came in the interview that we brought up, but I may have brought in something from an outside source, and I apologize if you're wondering where that came from. So, first of all, he talks about David, and that seems to be his favorite argument. That's his favorite argument across the board. He talks about that when in 2 Samuel, Nathan is rebuking David for taking on the wife of Bathsheba, for killing Uriah. And one of the things that he said is, look, I've given you this kingdom. I've given you these wives. If you wanted more, all you had to do was ask. And recognize, too, that David is being rebuked. This is not a situation where God is saying, you know what, I wanted to give you more wives. All you had to do was ask. He isn't affirming this idea behind it. The ideas of wives and multiple wives in an ancient kingdom was that you took on the harem of the previous person. Now, David did have other wives that he took on for different reasons, but it doesn't necessarily make it so any more than it makes it right for him to kill somebody to take on their wife, or to have an affair with somebody as well. Regardless, one of the questions that it seems to just kind of keep bugging me, that I played over and over in my head, which is part of what God also said is, hey, I gave you this kingdom. I could have given you more. The idea of kingdoms we don't have in this country. If God was saying, look, giving you multiple wives is my way of saying and affirming that what you're doing is okay, then at that same time he is saying, I'm affirming the idea of a king. I'm affirming the idea of this ancient Near Eastern kingdom. He's affirming that idea, in which case then the United States is living in an act of rebellion for having a republic, because that is exactly not what God told David he was giving him, that he could have asked for more. That is not what God was saying. That is not what Nathan was saying as a message from God. He is merely rebuking him for taking something that God did not give him. Now, what I'm certain that Rich would argue is that, well, that just shows that, again, since David already had multiple wives, then that's the case. But David also had done a lot of other things that God did not necessarily approve. That's why David wasn't allowed to build the temple. There were certain things that God actually gave David. He gave him these victories, these military victories, but he said, you can't build the temple. You have too much blood on your hands. He ain't referring to just Uriah. He's referring to David's war-like mentality, his power, his skills that he did give him. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he's saying we ought to go out and kill nations and take them all over. He's not saying that we should have done that. But God did allow him that opportunity from there. We all fall short of the glory of God. Just because we do things that God is able to use doesn't necessarily make it right or make it good. The other thing, too, that I really struggle with, and I've asked him the question, and I've heard him answering to others, and I think he does a relatively decent job answering it, but I still don't believe fully, completely, is this idea of things that are prescriptive in the Bible and descriptive. There are certain things that describe what happens, and there are certain things that prescribe what should be. A lot of this is very, very evident in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, where we kind of see these moral laws come out. But there's moral laws, there's sacrificial laws, there's ceremonial laws, there's civil laws. There's a lot of different categories of laws through the Old Testament. The moral laws stay all the way. They stay all the way to the end. When Jesus says not one dot and tittle will go away from the law until all is fulfilled, he's not just referencing the fulfillment when he comes back. So the moral laws still stay, but certain laws were just describing what was going on at that time. And I think that's what's happening also with David. The second thing, and this is his biggest argument that he makes, is that sex equals marriage. Now, I struggle with this. Because to me, there is a logistical, chronological problem with this. Now, what he does try to adjust it to is try to say that marriage is only between two lawful people, which means that I cannot go out and have sex with another man's wife, if I were to do something like that, then that would be adultery and that would be wrong and unlawful in his mind, and I cannot marry, obviously, another man's wife. Notice, interesting, that polygamy or polygyny, because it's only dealing with a man can marry multiple women, but women cannot marry multiple men. That's a whole nother conversation, and one I did not get in with him. However, when I look at that, argument that he is making, that sex equals marriage, here's the problem I have. Let's say there is a Christian woman at my church who is a virgin, and I say, you know what, I decided that I'm going to have sex with her as a means of getting married. By doing such a thing, at what point in time does it become marriage, and what point in time does it become adultery? Do you see, the problem is that as soon as I start engaging in any type of sexual activity, at that point in time, it becomes adultery. It doesn't become marriage right at that point in time. So I'm already committing adultery before I'm officially married to this person. At that point in time, it's no longer lawful. There is a chronological problem that he has to struggle with, that he cannot find the answer to. Now, if he's trying to say it occurs at the exact same moment, well, you can't have adultery and marriage at the exact same moment. That doesn't happen. So what he does is he just decides to eliminate this idea of adultery as long as the woman is there. Now, this ignores other laws that were on the books at the time, and Jewish tradition and other traditions that were around at that time. However, we'll get to that one in just a minute. The other problem is that the Bible tells us, well, Jesus tells us, that it's one man and one woman that equals a marriage. It reflects the concept and idea that occurred in Genesis when God said that as well. However, the other problem is this, is Deuteronomy also tells us that when a man and woman get married, the man is to leave his family and cleave to his wife. Now, cleave in this situation, cleave actually has two meanings, both in the Bible and both in every day. Like a cleaver is used to separate two pieces of meat. But that's obviously not the case. He is not to separate from his wife as soon as he married. That makes no sense. Cleave also means that you stick together no matter what. The other verses of the Bible where we see the idea of cleave is where we talk about cleaving to God. There's probably 20, 30 verses in the Bible where we talk about cleaving to God. Now, if I am to cleave to my wife and cleave to God, and those are the two same things that are happening, and the two same verbs that are happening at that point in time. At that point in time, if I can go now after other gods, because that's if cleaving allows me to do that. But God clearly does not like that. God clearly punishes nations for leaving. Idolatry is one of the 10 commandments. Idolatry and worshiping other gods is against one of the 10 commandments. This is a very bad thing that God looks at. So when I cleave from one to the other, when I'm cleaving to my wife, that means I'm not to look at other wives. I cannot look at other things. That is a very powerful piece that I think that is ignored when we're looking at what Deuteronomy is telling us to do. Now, he also argues that, part of the problem is because there is all these other problems with marriage, that God created the institute of marriage. We agree on that. But he says because of the fallen nature of man, there's all these other problems with marriage. I would argue that polygamy or polygyny or whatever Rich Tidwell is arguing for is that falling nature of man that is coming into something that God has created and that God has done for us. The other thing that is mentioned, that he mentions, is that Jesus did not condemn it. Jesus didn't condemn a lot of things. Jesus did not condemn slavery. Now, when I asked him that, he tries to distinguish between involuntary servitude and slavery, and although he is correct in some of that sense, but it is not fully correct. There is some situations of slavery where they conquered different nations and different nation states and was able to take them as slaves forcibly. There are laws about that. It was never condemned. There were a lot of things that Jesus did not condemn because Jesus did not come in order for us to give us a new list of things that are right and wrong. By the way, God already told us these things. God already told us that in the Old Testament, he already told us what is right and wrong. Jesus didn't need to come and reaffirm all of this stuff. Most of the time where Jesus said what was right and wrong was usually an answer to questions that were being posed by him in different ways. Jesus doesn't, until Revelation, doesn't really condemn homosexuality. He does condemn sexual immorality. And sexual immorality does include homosexuality, but it also would include polygamy. It would also include having sex with somebody who was not your wife. We also see this later where Paul is talking about this in Timothy, where he says the elders cannot have more than one wife. Now, if that were the case, what that meant was that they cannot even been married before. It does not imply that there are people out there that had multiple wives. Roman law at the time made it illegal to practice polygamy. So he wasn't saying that at all. But even if he was, then Rich in and of itself is also violating that standard as well. The reason why is because Rich sees himself as a pastor, an elder of some form or fashion. He is only supposed to have one wife. Now, he also talks about marriage again being between lawful, and he says it has to be between two believers, but that's not the case at all. Paul acknowledges that marriage is lawful even between a believer and unbeliever. The Bible references Potiphar and his wife. It references Pharaoh and his wife. It references Pilate and his wife. These are all legitimate marriages that the Bible recognizes and acknowledges. A marriage can be legitimate between people who are not lawful or who are not between believers, which would be lawful according to Rich. That is not the situation at all. Now, the next piece of this, and I think this is very important, he talks about that the Romans were the ones that banned it, that what we're doing is we're living under a Roman system, that we're living under this Roman tradition. And as a result of us living under this Roman tradition, that's where the problem is. However, I pointed out there are many things: the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Elephantine Puperi. We see old ancient documents that indicate this. There are documents in the 400 BC, about the time of Malachi, by the way, the prophet that says that God abhors divorce. But during that time, there was Jewish soldiers that it was part of a contract that affirmed monogamy because it's between two people. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually show in the Damascus document, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which occurred during the time of the Second Temple. During that time, the Damascus document says that polygamy is the same as fornication. Fornication is one of the sins that Jesus condemns. So we see problems with that from there. The next thing he tries to argue is he tries to argue from a symbolic point of view. By the way, you always got to be very careful of anybody that argues from Revelation from a symbolic to a practical verse now. I think we have to be very careful in that situation. But he argues two types of symbolism. One from the Old Testament, that God was married to Israel and Judah. And then the second one, that Jesus is married to the seven churches in Revelation. We run into problems here, and part of the problem is this, let's just take the God and Israel and Judah piece. He also says Israel and Judah committed adultery. He also said, and yet at the same time, God remained married to that. Again, it was a symbolic nature. It wasn't talking or affirming marriage or polygamy. He was trying to explain to them that they have a unique relationship with God, and for them to go away and chase idols and do that type of stuff was wrong. It was something to represent the symbolism that leaving and going to another nation, that leaving God and going for somebody else for help is the exact same as trying to marry more than one person. The argument that he is making in this sense fails on its face, because what God is actually doing is condemning them for trying to be with somebody else. With Jesus and the seven churches, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And once again, it's symbolic. But at the same time, the symbolism goes away when you recognize that the seven churches are no more. There is no more church of Laodicea. There's no more church of Ephesus. There's no more church of Philadelphia, Sardis, all that. There's no more churches for that. So did he divorce them symbolically? That's not what happened at all. Because again, it's a symbolic use of the term. However, what we do, though, is when we go further into Revelation, and we see in Revelation 19:7, it says that is when the Christ marries the church. That is when the marriage actually takes place. So everything prior to that would be an engagement. Everything prior to that would be dating. Everything prior to that would be the setting up of the relationship, symbolically speaking. However, what we see is, though, before they can actually marry, they have to go through the tribulation. We got to go through the bowls, the scrolls. We got to go through the 1,000 years before Christ actually marries the church. So what we see is we see him taking this symbolic nature on the front end, but ignoring it on the back end. The other thing he ignores is the fact that we're married to one church, not multiple denominations. He tries to get out of this by talking about the assembly and how the assembly was made up of multiple people. And then he references the family, and the family could be made up of multiple wives. But that's not the same at all. My family is made up of one wife and two kids. So the one church, but is one family. The one church does not necessarily mean multiple churches. It means multiple members within it, just like a family, but as a marriage symbolically with one church. And that is the reference between the reference from God to us, and not something that is setting forth rules in relation to polygamy from there. Now, the other piece that he talks about is he said that the reason why he likes the idea of polygamy is that polygamy is used for two reasons. One, it protects women, and two, it is to go forth and multiply. What he is saying is that Satan is trying to stop the idea of polygamy, because Satan, by doing so, is trying to stop God's command of go forth and multiply. And that through polygamy in the Old Testament, they were able to go forth and multiply. Now, with that being said, I think it is important. Let's look at first one, that polygamy protects women. Number one, it does not. In current societies now, like the Muslims believe in polygamy up to a certain number of people. However, look at the women there, and do you think they're protected? What it does is it cheapens women. What it does is it allows them to become more of property. It allows them to be seen as just one of many instead of one special person. It cheapens the idea of women. And when you cheapen women, when you cheapen any human being, then it increases the risk of danger towards them. That's exactly what happened in the 1800s and 1700s here in the United States. When we saw black slaves as less than, we created we created these problems for them. Now, it does not protect them. But again, when we look at other areas, we also see that there's higher incidences of suicide. We see that there's higher incidences of conflict. We see there's higher incidences of abuse. This is what we see when we look at these polygamous societies that are located in other parts of the world. Second thing is when we're talking about going forth and multiply, that doesn't make any sense at all. So right now, there is about an even number of men and women. It doesn't matter what culture you look at or what age group, and there, it does kind of fluctuate a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty even. So if I were to go and have 3 wives, if I were to go and do that, there are 2 other men now that cannot find wives because I've now moved the scales in a different direction. Well, by doing so, I didn't increase, because I increased maybe having children with 3 women, but I decreased the opportunity for somebody else to do it. There's another problem from the economic perspective. He maintains that we have to be able to do it as long as we can take care of the women, take care of the family. Well, guess what? If I can only afford to have 2 children, and I can't afford to have 4 children, then I can have one with one wife, one with a second wife, and that's all I can do. However, if I can afford 2 children, and Bob over here can afford 2 children, but Bob now no longer gets to be married because I took another woman out of the market, now we are supposed to have 4 children, 2 from me, 2 from Bob. So, but even with that mindset and that idea, now all of a sudden we are pushing forward that the rich who can afford more children can have more wives. And we see where the problem is with that, right? So I think when we look at his argument, and he uses a lot of scripture and he uses a lot of this stuff, but I think the problem is that he is deceived. I think he is deceived logically, and I think he is deceived scripturally. And as a result, when he starts looking at scripture, he starts doing it to justify the position he already has. There's a confirmation bias involved in it. I think we're all guilty of that. I'm not throwing stones at him because I know I do it. When I look at times of being bold and outspoken, I'm going to find those scriptures a lot quicker than the times I'm going to be like, well, you know what, we do need to be a little bit more peaceful. That's the problem I have. I have to be very careful in this type of thoughts. So, with all that to say, we need to be very careful and look at Rich's arguments. I think we need to be very careful when we're looking at this idea of polygamy and what it is going forward, because it is a dangerous beginning stages of allowing problems and more problems with society moving away from God's truth. And ultimately, that is the most important thing, is God's truth. And that is the standard of which we should hold fast to. So, thank you so much for this, and God bless you.